Hello, everyone. I wasn't sure if I should just post the slides or present it and post it, so I'm just going to go ahead and present it and post it. And I suppose I'll post the slides as well. So, let me get started here. Okay. So, the title of this is the OST 67 International Foundations and a Promethean Awakening. Now, I chose to answer a few questions about the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. I chose this topic because I find the OST not only an integral part of the history of American space diplomacy, but also an integral part of its future. I also find the document itself, much like I find the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or Thomas Paine's Common Sense, to be a piece of literature worth returning to time and again. So, my objectives in this case were to understand the significance of the Outer Space Treaty and why it is important foundationally for future space endeavors, and to seek out methods and recommendations for legal and or political addendums to assist the OST in meeting and surpassing the needs of the current and changing political and commercial world. If I were to have a thesis, I would say it would be that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was and is an invaluable piece of international law. In an expanding social, political, and corporate world, the OST must be updated with clear and applicable laws and applicable rules and regulations while remaining malleable for future worldwide technological, political, and social evolutions. So, it might be prudent to ask exactly, when you're exploring the landscape of the OST, what is it? The answer to that question has several parts, and for us to really explore it accurately, we will need to put this piece of legislation into a historical context. In the post-World War II world, the United States had established itself as a superpower unlike anything the world had seen since the Holy Roman Empire or the British Empire, for that matter. With the split of the atom and the creation of the atom bomb, the United States had held something of a militaristic monopoly over the entire world. The question of whether to use the atom bomb was another question. It is worth noting that at this time, the Japanese nation was not fighting for the Nazi doctrine or ideology, but rather for Emperor Hirohito, who had convinced the population of Japan that it was more honorable to die than to surrender. After the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the decision on how to end the war was on President Truman. The idea of an invasion of Japan appeared to be the most obvious answer, but this was a dangerous gamble, considering the Japanese mentality towards the war, the fact that women and children had been trained to use basic weapons to kill, and the existence of kamikaze pilots that could simply destroy whole waves of Allied soldiers. So the decision was made, and Little Boy and Fat Man were dropped, and after that the world changed. But with a sort of fear-based piece, there was something else bubbling underneath all of that, and here we come to Wernher von Braun. Now, Wernher von Braun is known in the modern age as the father of the V-2 rocket, which propelled rocket science into the mainstream. He was a German aerospace scientist and a space architect, and he was also a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. Now, after the Third Reich fell and the war ended, there were teams of Nazi scientists that were torn between two of the major Allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the German scientists had the option of joining the Communist East or the Capitalist West. Now, Wernher von Braun and his brother Magnus, along with their rocket team, chose to join the Americans, since the Soviet Union was known for its harsh treatment of POWs. This intelligence program to disband Nazi scientist groups and disperse them among the United States and the Soviet Union was known as Operation Paperclip. This operation meant that not only was the United States a scientific powerhouse, but the Soviet Union had tagged in as well. And near the end of the war, the US and Soviet Union led to the formulation of the Yalta system, in which unprecedented opportunities for the two nation states could be made. And this system was designed based on the mutual interests and strategic coordination between the two countries. However, differences in ideologies and political regulations caused the Yalta system to push the United States and Soviet Union into a strategic mutual mistrust, forming the dawn of the Cold War. Now I know what you're thinking. what does any of this have to do with the OST? And we're getting there. See, this difference between the Soviet communist and United States capitalist ideologies would lead to a need for supremacy in the new frontier, which was space. With the invention of ICBMs and intercontinental ballistic missiles, it became clear that the next frontier for dominance was not over the hill or across the ocean, but it was above. And here we arrive at the space race. Now, the space race can basically be defined as an arms race between the military prowess of the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, due to von Braun, the world knew that the future of warfare was rocketry. And due to Operation Paperclip in the Yalta system, the US and the Soviet Union had locked themselves into a war of military might. The might of the United States was seriously questioned when Sputnik 1 was successfully launched in 1957, prompting the United States to launch its own satellite in the form of Explorer 1 in 1958. However, the floodgates were open, and the communist Soviet Union had put their foot in first. The first successful launch of the ICBM by the Soviet Union in 1958 caused the United States to launch its own a year later, and you can kind of see how this is escalating. Despite these victories for the Soviet Union, among many others, there were still no real goals or determinations to the space race. The ultimate objective was quite nebulous, and that was until JFK's speech in 1961. President John F. Kennedy challenged the United States to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And from there, the issue was clear. The space race had become a race to get boots on the moon. The US and the USSR were off and running. I'd like to just rewind for a moment and touch on this quick. The importance of Sputnik 1 cannot be trivialized. The name Sputnik means fellow traveler, which carries with it a peaceful connotation. But the message of the satellite itself was anything but. Sputnik 1 was launched in the hollowed-out casing of a nuclear missile, of a rocket, which sent a message to the United States basically stating that the Soviet Union could place an atom bomb into orbit and send it down to any place on Earth, thereby striking at its enemy over immense distances with precision and no way for the nation under attack to defend itself. Now, this caused the United States a great deal of discomfort and panic, because it meant that the US could no longer hold its superior position in space. And it also meant that the US was going to need to launch its own entities into space, and whatever one nation did, the other felt a need to surpass. With the threat of mutual destruction, the regulations and rules needed to be put into place to keep either nation from using the space landscape, or lack thereof, in a militaristic manner that could threaten the continuation of humanity through the progressing technological age. In other words, rules needed to be made or we were all going to die. And this, without further ado, is where the Outer Space Treaty comes in. Rather, it's the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to go ahead and just stick with OST 67. So, what is OST 67? Well, the OST 67 was formulated in 1967 in response to the escalation of the space race and an attempt to regulate the use of weapons in orbit and on celestial bodies. This treaty was considered by the Legal Subcommittee in 1966 and was largely based on the Declaration of Legal Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, which had been adopted by the General Assembly in 1963, but wound up adding a few provisions. The treaty is the framework and the basic principles for international space law. The provisions that were created and remain in the treaty are basically a means to maintain the space environment and ensure its utilization for peaceful purposes. So what are these provisions? Well, provision number 1 is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, which basically is to say that space is to be for the benefit of all humanity, and there is no national appropriation of any object. Number 2 is the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts, or the return of astronauts and return of objects launched into space. In other words, astronauts are to be considered emissaries of humanity. They are to be returned to their native state if they are picked up by one that is not theirs. Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, basically meaning the launching state is absolutely responsible for any damage caused by the space object it launches. The Convention on Registration of Objects launched into outer space. An object that's launched must be registered, and the Secretary General of the UN must be informed. And lastly, the agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. All activities on the moon, including its exploration and use, shall be carried out in accordance with international law. Now, the treaty was opened for signature by 3 depository governments: the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It was ratified by 63 countries in 1967, and it was then entered into force later that same year. Now, the objectives of the treaty were to implement the governance of international law governing space exploration, weapons testing, and territorial claims, preserve the space environment, de-escalate the growing tensions between the US and Soviet Union through the backdrop of the Cold War. The OST reasserted the original guidelines for outer space conduct, and it banned certain military activities, such as deploying weapons of mass destruction in space and on celestial bodies. It established state ownership and responsibility of and for projectiles launched, urged mutual participation in the protection of the space environment, and it provided for open observation and inspection of each state's activities and installations by others. So, was the Outer Space Treaty successful? Well, did the OST prevent nuclear war? Was it successful in ushering in peace, cooperation, and transparency between once quarreling superpowers? Did it succeed in achieving its key objectives? The answers to those questions will be given right now. Yes? No? Sort of. So, did the OST 67 de-escalate the Cold War and keep the United States and Soviet Union from mutual destruction? Well, we're here. I mean, I'm making this presentation from the comfort of my living room and not an underground bunker amid a nuclear winter, so the OST 67 was at least moderately successful. And although it would be exciting to say that the OST was the document that kept the world from nuclear annihilation at the hands of 2 major superpowers, the fact is that there were several arms deals and other documents and treaties that kept the world from destroying itself. And we have them here. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned nuclear explosions in space, underwater, and in the atmosphere, with strict rules regarding testing underground. Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons from 1968, an agreement to pursue general disarmament, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, which limits countries' deployment of missile defense systems to the national capital and one other ICBM site. So it's important to look at the legal implications of the OST. And although the OST was not the only treaty or set of treaties that prevented the mutual destruction of the US and the USSR, it did set important legal precedents. Now, it is true that the main objective of the OST was to prevent nuclear escalation and destruction. However, it was also designed to accommodate new space-related developments. The treaty successfully laid the groundwork for agreements in space law, despite its formulation between 2 nations with strained relations. The main aspect of the OST that must be understood is that it is not a series of legally binding laws necessarily, but rather a framework to foster beneficial international cooperation. Through the Cold War, the OST 67 was successful in keeping nations from destroying themselves and others. However, issues would compound through the ages, and the OST would struggle to maintain its place in an evolving world. The legal success and precedence of the OST cannot be understated, but with any legal document, vagaries exist, and language used can be nebulous. These issues would become clear upon Apollo 11's landing on the moon in 1969. So, what was that? After the space race had effectively ended with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin allegedly walking on the moon. Allegedly walking. How'd that get on there? No, not allegedly. They walked on the moon. Oh, no. No, get out of here. No. Okay, so here's the thing. I've encountered this a lot lately. We walked on the moon, and It was not faked, and the Earth is round. And it drives me nuts. There's this argument where the moon landing was faked and the Earth is flat because, I don't know, people want to feel special that they know something that no one else knows. And these people say the moon landing was faked because we didn't go back, but we did go back. We went back 6 more times. So we faked it 6 more times. And that's not including Apollo 13, which is a whole other issue because Apollo 13 didn't land on the moon. So we faked the first two and decided to stage a catastrophe. How did they decide that? Like, did they draw straws? Or did they hold a raffle? Like, hey, y'all, if you're a captain and your name rhymes with dim shovel, your mission's going to get sabotaged in the studio. Sorry, but don't tell anyone. It's like super secret. And not to mention the number of people who would need to be in on it and keep their mouths shut for decades. Like, have these people ever heard Buzz Aldrin speak? Have they ever seen an interview with him? Like, if you want to know if the moon landing's fake, get a glass of wine in that guy, and he'll spill the beans. But so far, no such luck. It drives me nuts. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah, right. So, post-Apollo. So throughout Apollo, the United States and the Soviet Union continued their respective space programs, despite budget cuts and waning public interest. So you see here, 1970, the Soviet craft Luna 16 would become the first automatic spacecraft to extract samples from the moon. Soviet Venera 7 would land on the surface of Venus. Skylab is, of course, launched in 1973. You have the Apollo 18 and Soyuz 19 rocket dockings, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Voyager 1 and 2 are launched. Voyager 1 goes into interstellar space on August 25th, 2012. Space Shuttle Columbia is launched, ushering in an era of reusability with a craft that can re-land and be reused for other missions. Challenger would follow in 1983. Discovery is launched in 84, and Atlantis is launched in 85. So space exploration continued for decades, and the OST maintained a level of propriety between the nations through its established foundations. And despite the budget cuts, NASA was going strong with its shuttle program, despite the expense. Unfortunately, that was until Shuttle Challenger in 1986. It exploded, killing everyone on board, including the first civilian to be entered into the astronaut program, Krista McCullough. This explosion called into question the corporate nature NASA had adopted. At that time, NASA had been relying on previous successes and was not necessarily considering the overwhelming safety issues the shuttle program had been struggling through. The explosion was caused by corporate government relationships and actions that resulted in serious operational disasters and organizational misconduct. Although a damaged O-ring was the technical reason for the disaster, the explosion itself was the collective product of a government agency and a private organization, listed here, culminating in corporate crime. Despite the signs of damage and wear to the shuttle, NASA and MTI continued to allow the astronauts to fly an unsafe ship. I wish I could say that was the only disaster among the shuttles, but in 2003, Shuttle Columbia would also explode upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. And this called into question the legality of what NASA was doing and how compensatory actions should be carried out in the event of disaster. And with this, among budgetary issues, the shuttle program would end in 2011. So let's move forward through today, in the present, from 2003. So it's no surprise that there have been profound governmental advancements in space technology throughout the years. NASA has enjoyed a plethora of achievements, including the Hubble and James Webb Space Telescopes, allowing unprecedented images of the cosmos and our place within them. The ISS has ushered in an era of cooperation that has seen even the US and Russia collaborate for peaceful operations and experimentations for prolonged space exposure. Now, through the years, new nations have joined the space realm, offering new and exciting options for collaborations and assistances between nations. The ISS operates through the collaboration of several different nations, with the key players being the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada. The ISS has been the most politically and legally complex space program ever undertaken, and this is because it is the first endeavor in space in which several different nations are operating together on one confined mechanism. Some nations have advanced their space programs, allowing them to reach the heights only recently available to the US and Russia. So in 2019, China became the third nation to land a craft on the moon and the first nation to do so on the far side of the moon. And it currently has plans to land astronauts on the moon by 2030. In 2023, the Indian lander successfully touched down on the lunar surface, joining the US, Russia, and China in the moon exploration endeavor. Now, through all of this, the OST has remained relevant, assisting in the maintenance of a relatively peaceful relationship between nations in space. Now, the OST has come a long way since 1967, with 110 states parties having signed and another 89 having signed but not yet completed ratification. However, the signature and cooperation of nations has become less of an issue in the new space age. One of the newest issues remains what is beyond the government, where enterprise kicks in corporations. Now, I say that commercial advancement in space technology is an issue, but that doesn't mean that it's an issue that needs to be addressed in any kind of negative light. In fact, it's quite the opposite. In my opinion, the commercialization and privatization of space and exploration through independent companies is one of the greatest things that could happen to the space endeavor. The only real issue is, how do we deal with commercial space legally? So let's explore that. So in 2010, company SpaceX became the first non-governmental organization to launch a spacecraft into orbit and return it to Earth safely. In 2012, they would go on to launch the Dragon 2 as a resupply craft for the ISS, bringing a new concept of contracting between NASA and a private company for the sake of ISS missions. Now, there are 10 companies that are currently pioneering the commercial space organizations, right? These are SpaceX, Boeing, Collins Aerospace, Blue Origin, Alliance, Sierra Space, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Virgin Galactic, and United Launch Alliance. Now, countless other lesser-known companies have joined the commercial space enterprise, and this is a great thing. But as stated earlier, it leaves legal issues to ponder. So, let's go over those. Obviously, again, there are issues that are brought about through corporations in space, so let's start with the ambiguity problem. Now, if rules and regulations are to be followed, linguistic ambiguity in the treaty will need to be addressed. And again, one of the biggest issues with the treaty is that the language is nebulous and the keywords are not clearly defined. So, for instance, the term outer space would need to be clearly defined. Traditionally, space is considered the area in which orbital satellites move. However, where do they move? Some satellites orbit at higher perigees than others. If satellites lower their perigees through technological progression, will the term space need to be changed to accommodate this? Space debris would need to be another term that is clearly defined. Is space debris just defunct rockets? Is it paint chips? What about active satellites? Is it just anything that gets in the way as we're trying to leave orbit, or could crash into something else? Weapon. What would weapon be defined as? What is it? Technically, anything and everything could be used as a weapon. A hammer is a tool, but it is also a weapon. These things would need to be strictly defined if we were to edit the OST. Cooperation. Now, as stated earlier, other nations such as China and India have begun their own space agencies and they've seen success, and this could be considered a stride forward. But the articles of the OST 67 predicate themselves on the idea that humans will work together to maintain a peaceful environment in space. Now, this is ideal, but it is not the nature of humanity, nor is it what history and current events have taught us. With the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, as well as China's balloon caught over the United States soil recently, not to mention the general secrecy and lack of transparency in the Chinese space program in general, what exactly can be considered cooperation? What incentive would one have to be cooperative and follow the rules? This would need to be another issue that is solved. Transparency, again, as I mentioned it with the Chinese space program. Most satellites now are dual use. So how can one expect to trust that a nation that launches a satellite into space is only going to commit to the mission that the satellite launched is supposed to do? Ideally, each nation should register their craft with the UN through the registration convention, but how can one trust that the craft is not designed for more than one purpose? And if it is, how can punishment be enforced? And this leads us to regulation and enforcement mechanisms. I start this with orbital debris because that is a major issue. Companies such as SpaceX have tried to mitigate this problem with reusable second stages, but what makes them do that other than wanting to? If someone breaks a rule of the OST, what exactly are the consequences? Do they get sanctioned? The OST 67 does not consider the need for an organization or a nation state to be rewarded for the task it has been chosen to undertake. Therefore, clear incentives must be established if you're going to play by the rules of the OST. I want to speak briefly on the Commercial Space Act, the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015. Now, it was signed to ensure the stability of the continued growth of the commercial space industry. It states that individuals who collect pieces of celestial bodies and can keep, it states that individuals who collect pieces of celestial bodies can keep them, but anything in place on the body itself is not for appropriation. But these provisions lack legal aspects of settlements on celestial bodies, such as the moon or Mars. And the thing is, when the OST 67 was made, the idea of formulating a settlement, it kind of seemed the stuff of science fiction. I mean, as stated earlier, the objective was simply to get boots on the lunar surface. The idea was not seriously explored to really stay there. So the prospect for resource use in the future creates this need for some type of appropriation and property right through settlements and through the OST. So I went ahead and put together just a few ideas. The ideas of the OST are great, but like any international agreement, there are vagaries throughout the document. So as it states, outer space, the Outer Space Treaty itself, and outer space is to be the province for all. And I still agree with that. Each nation, despite its political leanings and formulations, must allow each other access to outer space. Liability convention is still important. States are still responsible for devices launched. The only other idea I kind of thought of was a prerequisite for launching an object into space is an orbital cleanup or maintenance procedure that comes with it. Any case without the cleanup procedure would be turned away. No violent act of any kind is permissible under any circumstances by any nation. Otherwise, you will face severe liability issues. The Moon Agreement, which means that weapons still cannot be placed on the moon. And a weapon definition in this case would be anything deliberately used to hinder or destroy nation progress in space or on any celestial body. The Rescue Agreement, in which astronauts are still considered emissaries of humanity. But also, no acts of violence of any kind are permissible under any circumstances by any nation. And lastly, registration. Registration Convention. All objects must still be registered through the Secretary General of the UN as always. The object being launched is subject to inspection by neutral parties pre-launch. And lastly, I wanted to just touch on some things that I think future policy should focus on. Obviously, I think that keeping the peace in space is important, maintaining the peace and freedom for exploration of all nations, much like the Antarctic Treaty currently does. Developing an orbital cleanup and reusability program, not only for ships, but settlement devices to keep pollution from reaching the moon and other celestial bodies, or from creating a Kessler syndrome, not only on Earth, but even on the moon or Mars someday. Appropriation regulations, so nations cannot force monopolies upon other nations for space property and resources. An appropriation regulation that should be based upon the size of the nation, perhaps, and the length of time that the nation has been in space. Land delineation control and enforcement mechanisms, perhaps some type of space federation, something kind of similar to, I guess, what they have in Star Trek. Perhaps we can use remote sensing to assist us in that. And finally, budget. That's the $1 million word, literally. When a president enters office, they formulate their budget. So they send their budget to Congress, and then they can edit or approve the budget. And typically, the U.S. spends $4.1 trillion annually. Now, the types of spending are split into two categories. There's mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Now, mandatory spending is exactly what it sounds like. It's spending that is needed. It's mandatory. This includes Social Security and Medicare. Mandatory spending accounts for approximately 2/3 of the spending in the U.S. The last third of the spending is called discretionary spending, which is delineated depending upon the discretion of the president and the executive branch. Now, this is where focus can shift. Typically, just over half of this money will go to defense spending. Now, here's the thing. There are 25 countries that are heavily militarized in the world. The United States spends more on its military than all of them combined. The U.S. military budget is typically $655 billion. Now, you compare that to the next superpower in the world, Russia, with a military budget of $65 billion. Now, I am not delusional enough to think that the U.S. does not need a powerful, robust, and well-funded military. However, I do think that it could be a good opportunity for some of the money from that military fund to be reappropriated to the science and educational systems. And it would actually be quite simple because these systems all fall under the same umbrella as the defense spending. Now, we've already proven that we drop billions of dollars in a nation militarily, right? The recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, in which we left at least $13 billion in weapons with that nation, it proves that the distribution of the money that we are spending is warped. So what could we have done in the science programs with just half of that $13 billion? Lastly, I would like to talk just briefly about a potential future of corporate and governmental collaboration. Governmental and corporate integration is coming. It's actually pretty much already here. We're already seeing it with SpaceX and Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, and others. Contracts between space agencies and private space companies will soon become commonplace. The next step would be international, corporate, and governmental collaboration. Should nations allow the free market to help create space exploration opportunities, a space race would be necessary and beneficial for all involved. Now, with all of this said, is the OST 67 still relevant? Should the space age have ended in 69? Not only is the OST still relevant, it is a profoundly important document for the future of space exploration and peace. It is a document originally designed to keep two superpowers from destroying each other and those around them. In the shifting geopolitical landscape, these superpowers have multiplied and shifted. However, they will always need to be regulated, not only to keep the nations from destroying each other, but to allow other nations to join the final frontier. Now, space is to be the province for all humanity, and if this is true, the OST is more important now than ever. Therefore, it must not be abandoned, it must be modified and expanded upon for a more civilized age. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was and is an invaluable piece of international law. In an expanding social, political, and corporate world, the OST must be updated with clear and applicable rules and regulations while remaining malleable for future worldwide technological, political, and social evolutions. Thank you for joining me on this. I appreciate your time. You all have a great weekend.